Alright, so we have created a project and imported our media to the project. If you've missed that, please check out the previous episodes through my link in the description before moving on. So we have learned that the left monitor of the Composer window over here is the source monitor, which we can use to preview the media source files. And if you look just under it, you can see this green line here as well. This color always means that we're working with a source file. So if we open up a bin with the camera files, double click on the icon next to the name on one of the files. As you can see, the media will appear in the source monitor, but it will also appear down on the timeline. As we can see to the very left of the timeline, these green buttons indicate that this is the source file that we currently have in our source monitor. And we can also see that this media consists of one video track and two audio tracks. If we head over to the sequence bins and open up a sequence, it will appear in our record monitor, which has a blue line below it. And this blue color means that we are working with a sequence. So if we take a look at the timeline, we can see the blue buttons for the sequence as well. And the sequence in this case has one video track and 3 audio tracks, as you can see. This is something crucial to understand how it works. When we move material from the source file to the sequence, it's very important that we have the patching between the source file and the sequence set up correctly, or otherwise weird things are going to happen with our sequence, which we don't want, obviously. So we have the green buttons here to the left for our source file and the blue buttons for our sequence. If we, for example, only would want to move the video to the sequence, then we have to disable the 2 audio tracks here on the source file. And it's easy to think that if we don't want to move the audio to the sequence, we need to disable the audio tracks on the sequence as well, but that depends. If we, for example, would disable the audio tracks here on the sequence and try to splice in it in the video. So as you can see, the video has been moved to the timeline, but what happened over here with our clip with the Thai's shoes? The video is now 68 frames ahead of the audio, because we have spliced in video on the video track, but we didn't have the audio tracks enabled while we did it. So we have to undo this and have the audio tracks enabled while splicing in, or else the video will lose its sync with the audio. So if we try it again now, and as you can see, the video and audio is now in sync. But this time our music has been divided into 2 parts, and some of it has been moved ahead, which we don't want in this case, so we have to keep the 3rd audio track disabled while doing this. And there we have it. So as you hopefully understand, it's important to make sure that the patching is set up correctly, because if we make a mistake here, and then we keep making changes to the sequence without noticing that we have broken the sync, that could be quite a pain to get fixed without having to undo everything that we did after that point. If you didn't get how the patching works, I would recommend that you rewatch this part of the video before moving on, because this is such a crucial thing to understand. We can also use these buttons to patch material from a specific source track to a specific sequence track. If we, for example, only would want the 2nd audio track from the source file, and we want to move it to the 1st audio track in our sequence, we can disable the other audio tracks and drag and drop the 2nd audio track from the source clip to the 1st one on the sequence. And in this case, we would move the 2nd audio track to the 1st one onto the sequence. Alright, so now that we have learned about patching the tracks, we can move ahead to our empty sequence and get started editing. It's always good to go through all of the material first, play it in the source monitor, and rate them by setting different colors on them with this color option. You can use green for material that you want to use, yellow for material that you might want to use, and red for the takes that you most likely don't want to use. So before moving on, it's worth mentioning that the most efficient way to work in Media Composer is by using the shortcuts on the keyboard, and that's what Avid even expects you to do. There are keyboards that are designed for Media Composer with all these shortcuts printed on the buttons. I link one in the description in case you would like to grab one of these, but you're completely fine working with your regular keyboard, of course. but in that case you have to remember these shortcuts instead. The first thing we have to learn is how to set marks in the source clip. So if we open up one of them in our source monitor, so let's say I want the clip to start here, then I have to set the in mark right here, and one way to do it is with this button. Alternatively, you can use the shortcut buttons, either E or I on the keyboard, and I prefer E because I can reach it with my left hand while using the mouse with the right hand. And if we fast forward in the clip to set our out point, let's say I want to have the out point here, we can set the out point with this button, or R or O with the keyboard. So now that we have set our marks, we have two different ways to move it to the sequence. We can either use Splice-In or we can use Overwrite. In this case, since we don't have anything in our sequence yet, this won't make any difference, we can use any of them. So let's splice in the material to our sequence with this yellow arrow, or using V on the keyboard. If we, however, already have a material in our sequence, it would actually make a difference if we use Splice-In or Overwrite. So let's head over to my demo sequence to try this. Let's say I want to have this source material, and I want to have it right here in the middle of this sequence. So if we check the patching and then use the Splice-In method, we can see that everything is fine. All upstream media will be moved to make room for our new segment. But if we undo this and instead use Overwrite, you can see that our existing media has been replaced with the new one that we moved here. So this is how we work when we make a rough cut. We open the source files in our bin, we set marks for which part we want to use, and then we move it to the sequence with the Splice-In or Overwrite functions. And once we have several cuts in our sequence, if we would change our mind about one of the clips, let's say I want to remove this segment from the sequence. And one way to do it is to just press delete or backspace on the keyboard. This, however, will leave a filler instead of moving the upstream media to close the gap. So a better way to remove the material is to set marks in the sequence. And the fastest way to find the first and last frames on the clip is to hold down Ctrl or Command on the keyboard while dragging on this black bar here. This will make the marker snap to your cuts on the timeline. Another way to set marks on a specific segment on the timeline is to select it and then hit T on your keyboard. Once you have set your marks on the timeline, you can either use lift or extract over here. The lift function will work quite similar to using delete or backspace on the keyboard, but it will also take into consideration the patch that we have selected. So if we have this music track selected as well, when we use the lift function, you can see that it will lift this part as well. And if we instead would use the extract function, we would, like I mentioned, move all of the upstream media on our enabled tracks to close the gap instead of leaving a filler. And keep in mind, it's important to always have the correct tracks enabled, or else you might break sync between the video and the audio. A shortcut to clear your marks is G, or this button on the timeline. Another essential thing to know about while you make your rough cut is the Smart tool, which is this red and yellow arrow. We can enable it by clicking on it, and we can change its settings by right-clicking on it. As you can see, we have both Overwrite and Splice-In enabled in our Smart tool. And this means that while we move our pointer up and down on a segment, we will see this arrow shifting from red to yellow. And if it's yellow, we would use the Splice-In method, which in this case would move the segment up or down on the timeline, but it would not overwrite any of your material. And you can hold down Ctrl or Command on the keyboard to snap to your other cuts on the timeline. And if we instead use the red arrow, this will move the material and overwrite your other material on the timeline. Alright, so that will hopefully get you started. If you need to add the track to your sequence, you can right-click on the timeline and go Add Video Track or Audio Track, and Mono if you have a microphone, for example, or Stereo if you have music. I would recommend that you try to make a rough cut of the material that you have before proceeding to the next video where I will show you how to deal with the audio. So good luck and see you in a bit.